And so there are these two utilitarian tracks that you can take. I prefer the probabilistic track because it's based on the best information we have at the time, and that's all we can work with.
How can philosophy help us to understand the impact of lockdowns on South Africa and the rest of the world? I posed this question to Mark Oppenheimer and Jason Werbeloff in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. If you would like to check out the full interview with Mark and Jason, you can do so by clicking on the link in the description below. Enjoy.
One of the best ways we think to get to truth is through a clash of swords. So one of the things that I think people maybe find difficult about when they watch the show is trying to work out what my position is. I tend to adopt a position for the sake of argument because I think it's a good way to find out what's true from our guests. Jason often will be quite clear as to what his personal belief on a topic is, and will say, as a utilitarian, I hold the following, and I think you need to meet this requirement. I'm a little bit more opaque in that sense. Sometimes I might very well agree with everything the guest has to say, but I adopt a mock position of disbelief in order to try and interrogate and get the best possible view out of them. And so there's moments as well in our conversation on lockdowns where we adopt different points of view to try and best work out what's actually true, what's the right thing to do in these circumstances. It's one of those episodes that I thought would basically be completely and utterly irrelevant within a couple of weeks. I mean, I think everybody remembers that lockdowns were going to last 21 days. And really, we've only just dismantled them now. It's taken more than 2 years to get rid of all the final flourishings of it. We now no longer have face masks in South Africa, which I think you and I are both delighted about.
Yeah, and actually, you've had quite a productive output in terms of books as well. So not just the lockdown book, but a whole series of them, which we'll link to in the description below. I'd highly encourage you to check them out. They're very readable and very accessible, even for philosophical Philistines like myself. So Jason, there's the kind of this moral question around the permissibility of lockdowns and so on. What would you say is the utilitarian argument for a lockdown, and what would be some of the deontological rejoinders to that, just to continue the example that Mark has raised here?
Yeah, so the utilitarians are going to really care about the facts. So they're going to want to know what is the economic impact of a lockdown. So that would be the one track. And on the other track, how many people are going to die if you don't lock down? So they want the data. And one of the big problems throughout the pandemic is that the data has been so contested and limited and poor in many ways. And so we've only gained a stronger picture of what happened as time went on. But even that stronger picture, many people just deny that. They say that the data was flubbed, or the data has been read incorrectly or interpreted incorrectly, and there's survivorship bias, and there's all sorts of biases that people are accusing the scientists who collected the data of being guilty of. So we don't really know what the data is. But the utilitarian says, well, if we knew the data, or at least if we had a good idea of what the data was, if we knew what the percentage infection mortality rate of COVID was, for example, let's say it was much higher than it was. Let's say it was like 80%, it was like Ebola, and you didn't lock down, then you can assume that 80% of your society is going to die, or close to that. On the other hand, if you shut down the economy, it seems like far fewer people will die and the impact will be less, and the good overall that results will be positive. And so in that sort of situation, you want to lock down. But then let's take a far less severe disease than Ebola, something that has, let's say, a 0.5% mortality rate or a 0.1% mortality rate, like flu. You don't want to lock down in that case because the damage involved in locking down the economy is so great that it actually reduces people's quality of life and the duration of their lives. And so that's worse. So it's very important for the utilitarian to work out exactly what that infection mortality rate is and exactly how bad lockdowns are and judge them.
But I mean, don't you have then a calculation problem, which is, I mean, you can attempt to calculate utility and balance the different ends, the different consequences of a particular action. But I mean, ultimately, you're never going to have absolute certainty. It's like the difference between a grain of sand and a pile of sand. It's very hard to know, where that appropriate point is.
Yes. So in certain cases, you will have certainty or very close to certainty. So like in the Ebola case, you'll have pretty clear evidence that, well, everyone's going to die or almost everyone's going to die if we had like airborne Ebola and we don't lock down. So in that kind of case, I'm not too worried about the decimal points. It seems like overall we have a good idea of what's going on. But in the case of COVID, it was very unclear, and it really does seem like it's on the margin. And there, as you say, it's very hard to calculate. So utilitarians have two ways of dealing with this. So the one way is to say, well, we don't need to know exactly what's going to happen. We just look at the probabilities. And we say, well, there's a certain probability that something bad will happen on this track, and there's a certain probability that something bad will happen on that track. So on the lockdowns versus not lockdowns. And we just multiply the probability by the outcome and we get a utility calculation. And that's good enough. We do the utility calculation based on our best estimates at the time, which may later turn out to be wrong, but it's as good as we can get. So that's the one solution, which is my favored solution. The other solution is what's called actual utilitarianism, where you calculate backwards. So after the fact, we look back, we look at the data and we see what with 2020 hindsight, we see what the right decision was, and then we make a ruling. Well, it was wrong at the time to perform the lockdowns or right at the time based on data we later clarified. Of course, the problem with that solution is that you never know at the time what to do. And so there are these two utilitarian tracks that you can take. I prefer the probabilistic track because it's based on the best information we have at the time, and that's all we can work with.
Yeah, and the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard said that life can only be understood looking backwards, but it must be lived going forwards. So Mark, do you want to have a go at the deontological rejoinder there to the utilitarian argument for lockdowns?
Yeah, so there's two ways in which you can go. The one is you take a view that life is the most sacred value, and so intruding on people's economic freedoms is perfectly permissible because you're doing it in service of life. The other route is to say, no. What's going on is that you're intruding on people's basic rights by restricting their movement, by restricting their commerce, and that you cannot do that even if you're going to yield great consequences. And I think some of us have strong tensions in both directions, right? There's a feeling that there are certain things that are just morally impermissible, that a lot of people think, torturing someone, if you can yield great benefits out of it, is wrong, regardless of the benefits. I think a lot of people feel very uncomfortable about the idea of the state being able to lock people in their own homes involuntarily. And they think that was wrong, regardless of the good consequences. The other one is, as you say, to think about, well, what benefits could have been achieved through lockdowns? And we try to analyze this in some detail. The one view was that really all you could do was buy time. You can't keep people locked up indefinitely. Even in Jason's Ebola case, if the Ebola doesn't disappear and it's just going to be floating around and it has 80% kill rate, what does the lockdown do but buy time to have a cure? And so we said, well, one reason that you might want to have a lockdown is to, reduce strain on the hospital system, that there's certain class of people who are going to get COVID, and regardless of what intervention you have, they're going to die. And so a lockdown doesn't help them. There's certain people who are going to get COVID, and regardless of what you do, they're going to survive. So lockdown doesn't affect those. It's only really those people who need a hospital bed and will be denied it because the hospitals are overflowing that you could save. So you're looking at a small category of people. And so that's the bit you have to put on the scale. We had lockdowns in South Africa for really long periods of times when the hospitals weren't overflowing. The other thing that I think you've got to put on the scales is what happens when you give a government that kind of power? What are they going to do with it? And when are they going to relinquish it? And so if you really do just care about consequences, that's one of those things that matters. We know, for example, that in South Africa, the thing I was more scared about was the roving military and police who were going around enforcing these rigid rules, to the point where they killed someone for drinking a beer in his garden, Collins Causa. And the consequences of that are quite dire going forward. I think you see that the consequences of locking people up in their homes all around the world led to massive amounts of social tension. You had months of rioting in America, which I think are partly due to this repressed tension. So all of those consequences must be put in there, that utilitarians care not just about the particular thing that you're aiming at, but the unintended consequences. I probably call myself a moderate deontologist, which is that I think that rights really do matter and that you should be very wary about intruding on them. But there's going to be some cases where the benefits are so massive, or the costs of not intruding on the right are so big that you ought to do it. And so that's the sort of position that I take on that.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this discussion, you might want to check out the full-length interview with Jason Werbeloff and Mark Oppenheimer. That's linked over here. You can also check out other long-form podcast discussions on my other channel. That's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.